people who are supposed to take care of us are turning a blind eye. And that makes you question, who and what am I doing this for?
Welcome to Conversations with Intent. I am Diana Clark, your host this week, and I'm going to be talking about the silent crisis, mental health for healthcare workers. Beginning at the pandemic, our guest, Dr. Meenal Viz, was passionately involved in the advocacy for healthcare worker protections, leading campaigns that help drive critical policy changes at a really critical time all over the world. We're really excited to have her, and I'm looking forward to hearing about what has transpired during the pandemic for healthcare workers and beyond. I appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me just start with, I know your passion and your advocacy work started during the global pandemic. Can you tell us a bit about what you saw that drove that mission?
Yeah, I mean, prior to the pandemic, I worked about a year or so in the NHS, which is National Health Organization in the UK. And, you know, I loved going in every day. I loved meeting new people and continuing the care for my patients I was seeing on a daily basis. And a lot of the times I'd stay extra, do extra things just to keep my patients comfortable and happy. And you could call it goodwill. And it took me a long way. And there was plenty of goodwill in me because that's what I came into this profession for, was to help people. And things started to become more clear during the pandemic when patients were getting sicker, doctors were getting sick, and my own colleagues were being admitted into the emergency room, into the ITU, and they were put on ventilators, where it started to strike the big question that we are doing so much for our patients, we're doing so much for our service. Why is nobody taking care of us? Because obviously, if we were infected, then we would pass it on to our patients, which is obviously the last thing we wanted to do. And initially, I thought, okay, well, they might just have some teething problems. It's the first time people are experiencing this sort of global crisis. It might just take a bit of time for things to settle in. And I had that grace to just keep going and keep doing everything I could for my patients. And I was about 4 months pregnant when it came into the UK, when first COVID patient was diagnosed in the UK. And then slowly as time went by, we started to see how like one healthcare worker died, and it came on the news with like a big story behind this one person and his family and everything he'd done for the NHS and everything this person stood for. And, you know, so beautifully put for this person in honor of this person who passed away. And then as the days went by, it went from one healthcare worker to two healthcare workers, and it kept going. And as it kept going, the stories kept becoming more and more diluted. And I was just seeing numbers on the screen. And I thought, well, these are real people with real families, and these families are going to live with this for the rest of their life. And even more scary to think was I could have been one of them. And it wasn't until a pregnant nurse whose family lived down the road from me passed away of COVID. And she was 8 months pregnant, and she had given birth with an emergency C-section.
And you were pregnant at that time. Yeah. So you were pregnant at that time as well. Yeah.
So she gave birth in an emergency C-section, and she never got to hold her newborn baby. She passed away of COVID. So not only did she leave her newborn baby behind, she left her husband behind, a 2-year-old son behind. And I saw the grief that hit this family. We were at their home to help their little kids out. Her husband wasn't even able to hold the baby for a while because she was put in the pediatric ICU for some time because she had to get extra care. She was born a bit early. And there were no rules as to how to deal with this sort of grief because everybody was just following the rules that the government had made, which was without any rhyme or reason, without any scientific evidence, because clearly they did not have enough PPE and they were trying to cover it up. And that became obvious because we were wearing the full hazmat suits, our full protective gear right from the start. And then as days went on, it started to turn from real hazmat suits with the most protection into like these flimsy dinner lady aprons. And we were also using goggles that were donated from science schools just down the road. It was ridiculous. I still remember one day finishing a patient and I had to dump my goggles in a pot of bleach to disinfect it so we could reuse it the next day. So, we saw a lot at that time and it didn't seem right. And as doctors, we're also scientists, so we know how the infection works, we know how to stop the spread. Yet nobody was listening to our pleas to help us a lot more.
That's the physical transmission of a pandemic. What happens emotionally and to the mission and morale of healthcare when healthcare workers aren't being taken care of? What happens to them?
When I first started working, I never thought my goodwill would sort of run out. I didn't think it was something I could quantify because I've been wanting to do this for such a long time. I've been wanting to help people and be a doctor for my whole life. But when we could see how our politicians in the UK were sat in these fancy buildings, fully protected, making these decisions, and not once stepping on the shop floor in an emergency department or in a hospital, not once experiencing what it's like to wear PPE gear that dents your cheekbones and leaves you with marks on your face at the end of a long day. If they don't know what that feeling is like, then there is no empathy in their decision making. And that has a big trickle-down effect to our morale because the people who are supposed to take care of us are turning a blind eye. And that makes you question, who and what am I doing this for? Because between you and your patient, there is some red tape. You want to do more, but you're not given the right tools. And I describe it as going into war, but being given a butter knife to fight. That's what it was like.
I speak from my perspective of history. If it was war, they would have been amply prepared. This is different.
Absolutely.
So going into war with a butter knife in an emergency situation in a global pandemic, that's the tools you had.
Exactly. And not only that, we didn't have the right support system either. There was a lot of doctors who tried to speak up, including myself. We were escalating in all the right ways. For example, speaking to our managers, our bosses, and our leaders within the hospital. And they were just shutting us down and not giving us the right answers because ultimately they were receiving information from the government and the government had nothing to give them, so they had nothing to give us. And
they didn't have anything to offer at that point, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That they were going to.
We all felt very let down because our concerns were just being completely ignored. And this was really just a life and death situation.
So how did you get a voice? How did your voice get so big?
That's interesting. I've always been a very quiet person, believe it or not. Being the quiet person in class, I just got on with my life, put my head down, studied, got the grades I needed, never spoke up against the status quo. But as a brown woman being raised in Europe, as a South Asian woman being raised in Europe, I always had questions about my upbringing, my culture, and why I had to do things a certain way whilst others didn't, why I wasn't allowed to have more freedom than my other friends, for example, why I've always felt like my family was much more strict than others. So these were always questions brewing in my head, but I never felt confident enough to ask them or actually say them out loud. And when we had the pandemic, and this pregnant nurse had passed away, Mary Ajapong. She reminded me of my own father, because my own father came into Europe without anything, without any money, without any financial support. But he came here to build his life. And when he came here to build his life, he did it all by himself. And he was also in a position where if he spoke up or if he said anything that he didn't like, he felt that he wouldn't get to where he wanted to get to. And there were lots of people in similar situations during the pandemic who'd come from abroad to work in the NHS, but they were worried that perhaps their visa may get affected or their contract may get affected, which means that they can't stay in the country because of all the paperwork. And now we know, for example, Nurse Mary tried to speak up, and she tried to move from a highly infectious ward to a low infectious ward. And, she did plead to say, I'm not comfortable, but she was ignored. And this always takes me back to my own father, that if someone like my father had been treated so badly, how would it have affected the trajectory of my own life? Would it have meant that my father would have had to go back to India? Or, would I even exist? We don't know. So that's where the empathy started to build up and come from a different angle when I put myself in her shoes. And it was really just pure anger. I remember just sitting down watching the news one day with my husband, and we were looking at the health statistics about how many healthcare workers had died across the world. And I just burst into tears. And I couldn't live with myself if I just sat down, watched the news every single day for the next year or 2 years, and just accepted what I was seeing in front of me. Because I don't know, it's a very difficult thing to describe, because because I was pregnant, I always thought if it was my own daughter, what would I tell her? I wouldn't tell her to just sit down and watch these people get hurt or these people be treated unfairly. And with the same token, in 10 or 20 years' time, my daughter will grow up to learn about the pandemic. And, rightly so, she will ask me, Mommy, what did you do during this time when people were being affected, when people died? And it was all of these sorts of scenarios that I was playing in my head all the time that led me to speak up. And it all really came from a place of pure frustration and anger.
Anger can be such a great motivating force for us to do and have a voice, right? I think sometimes we think we'll be motivated from kind and gentle emotion, but more than not, in an advocacy position, anger is the motivating force. So do you recall the exact number of people you were watching TV that day and heard about healthcare workers? Was that number sort of emblazoned for you, or was it just another day with a bigger number?
I don't remember exactly what number it was, but I do remember it had passed the 100 mark. And that's when I thought, well, at what point do you say this is enough? Do you just wait it to go up to say this is the limit? This is where we're going to actually start acting and doing something about this? I mean, at what number do you say we need to do something? Or do we just let the numbers go up? But I do remember it was above 100.
So what did you do? You have this moment, you're watching TV, you get angry, you're thinking about your daughter, you're thinking about what message, what model you would like to have for her. What did you do next?
I remember I had to go for a checkup. I was about 24 weeks pregnant at that time. And because of COVID, they'd moved all the clinics around. So I had to drive out a little bit to this randomly secluded place to get my checkup done in a safe way. And in that time, while I was waiting for my turn, I thought, let me ask a few of my friends, close friends, what they think about a protest or a joint action movement. Because, at that time, we were seeing the impact on the news channels. We were seeing some photos of people in the hospital. We were seeing some video footage of doctors and nurses. but nobody really saw a doctor or healthcare worker actually say something or like stand up in front of a camera and say, this is wrong, this needs to be fixed. It's almost like the media, to some extent, as well as the government, were displaying a sort of sanitized version of what was really happening. And I think that's what was going through my head, that how can we make a real impact by saying, okay, we are doctors, this is what we're seeing, this is what's wrong, let's all take action together. And after speaking to a few of my friends, although they agreed with the idea that something needs to happen, something needs to change, the response was common response was actually, don't want to speak up because, I'm a bit scared. And some doctors were to the extent where they didn't really think that it was such a big problem because they couldn't really foresee what was going to happen. I was just thinking, well, we've seen 100 people die, it's just going to go up and up and up. Whereas other people thought that, other people had a bit of trust in the government that they might just put a lid on it. But I couldn't see that trajectory. I knew that it was just going to get worse. So overall, people said, no, we can't do this with you. And the only person really who agreed with me and was happy to bounce ideas with me was my husband. And I think at that time, I was a little bit naive on what the consequences could be. I think I was blinded by my rage and my frustration because I just wanted to get something done. But this decision was made a few days after Nurse Mary had passed away. And I had to do this for Mary, and I had to do this for her children, because I knew that her children would grow up one day and say, well, who stood up for my mother? Did somebody do anything when my mother was mistreated? And I couldn't live with myself if I hadn't done that. So we bounced ideas between me and my husband. We bounced ideas between each other. And eventually we just came to the idea, well, if they see a pregnant woman outside Downing Street with a big sign, then it might actually raise alarm bells. And that's exactly what I did.
And what did the sign say?
So that's an interesting point, Dan. And I mentioned it in my book quite a lot about how a lot of thought went into what the sign was going to say. Because although we were doctors and we needed help, so did nurses, so did lots of different people who needed more protection. So I wanted it to be an inclusive message for healthcare workers, which is why I wrote on the sign, protect healthcare workers. And I could have written a lot of things. I could have written things about the government. I could have written things about policies. But I thought, what is one sign that people can read clearly and visually what it would look like in the protest? So I wrote down protect healthcare workers. And I still remember ordering like bamboo sticks on Amazon and ordering this big white card that I could write on with markers. And that's the photo of me standing outside number 10, outside Downing Street, with the mask on and the sign that went completely viral after that protest.
So you have a sandwich board, you're in front of Downing Street, protect healthcare workers. What happened? It goes viral. What happens next?
Yeah, so as I was outside protesting, I still remember looking at I remember there were pink flowers right above me, actually, on a tree. And I was thinking, wow, spring is blooming. The flowers are beautiful. But actually, there is hell going on in the hospitals. So it was such a big disparity in what I was seeing and what was really happening during the pandemic. There were lots of ambulances going by as well, and lots of ambulances hooting at me as well as a sign of support, which was very encouraging. And I still remember feeling quite dizzy at that time, because remember, I was 5 or 6 months pregnant. So, my blood pressure was dropping as I was standing up for so long. But I felt my baby kick inside me, and each kick was just a reminder that I just had to keep going. Like, there was no option to just stop. I stood there for a few hours, and I left my sign right in front of Downing Street, hoping that Boris Johnson would just walk out and maybe see that sign. But once I left it there, I went home, and I still remember throwing myself onto the sofa and just taking a long nap, because it was an intense few weeks just building up to this protest, and I was completely exhausted. And then when I woke up, I put the news channel on, and they were going through the newspapers for the next day as part of their media cycle. And there was a massive photo of me right in front of the front page of the Telegraph. And I thought, oh my goodness, because a lot of people still don't even know I'm pregnant. So the headline was pregnant doctor protests outside Downing Street. And I thought, oh no, like everyone's going to find out and everyone's going to get really upset because I didn't tell them personally, but it's on national news. And then I logged on to Twitter, and my Twitter had blown up. Someone had actually taken a photo of me. I think it was an Associated Press photographer who was driving by and had seen that, and that went viral on Twitter. So from there on, I was engaging in a lot of conversations with people about why I did this protest and why it was so important. There were people, of course, who didn't agree with me, especially, surprisingly, doctors as well. But everything went viral from there. And then as I started speaking up more, I found more of my voice. I found out, that actually we can speak up. And that protest was a clarion call to people all over the world that if you're not happy with the state of affairs, it's okay to speak up, because unless you speak up, change isn't going to happen. So when you ask me, how did you find your voice? Actually, I never found it and then spoke up. It's more like I found it as I went along. I took that initial step as a risk, just out of anger and frustration. But then as I went along and started speaking to more people, speaking to the media, speaking on the news, I found more of my voice and what all of this meant to me.
And was change a result? Did you get more PPE? Did things actually shift as a result?
From there, we took things a step further. So my husband and I actually took the government to court. And within that court case, we sent them a letter to explain the situation and why, A, we need more PPE, and 2, why the PPE guidelines were not in line.
And do you think if we were to have another pandemic similar to that, we would be more prepared now?
I think all the evidence, all the information is there. And that's the most important thing. That all the research has been done, all the science has been, all the data has been collated together, collected, and we have enough evidence to show what works and what might not work. The question comes down to policies and all the bureaucracies. It depends on our politicians and our health ministers and our leaders to implement this information in the right way. And what we saw during COVID is, despite having this information, they chose to ignore it.
So I love that comment you just made, that it wasn't like you found your voice, and it was you found your voice along the way you were speaking. So as you were brave, you got braver. As you had a passion, you became more passionate. And that harkens me to a quote by William Sloane Coffin. Says, "I love the recklessness of faith. First you leap, then you grow wings." And I can see that's what you're talking about. What gives you hope from that, after that real experience of trauma? What gives you hope?
Well, through everything I did, I found so many people who care about social justice issues. So many people reached out to me, explaining how they were in similar situations, but they were afraid to speak up. And my protest gave them a sign that it was time for them to make a change. And I have a lot of hope for the world ahead of us. I really do, Diane. I know that things look very bleak at the moment. There are lots of political issues around the world. There are lots of starving children, lots of people, innocent people being killed. And I look at my own voice, and I look at the voice I'm going to give to my daughters and how I want to pass the baton on. that's enough faith for me to hold on to keep going.
Thank you. That's a lovely note to end this on. Thank you, Dr. Meenal Viz. We are delighted that you spent time with us, you and your daughter. What's your daughter's name?
Yes. She is Shivika, and she's baby number 3. So I have a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 4-month-old.
Not busy at all. Not busy at all.
We've got lots of change makers on the way, Diana.
Thank you. I love that.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time today, Dr. Meenal Viz. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. If you liked this episode, please like us on your platform of choice. And if it generated any questions or concerns, or maybe even your own miniature protests, please email us at conversations@intentclinical.com.